Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Carla Sáenz. I am Regional Advisor on Bioethics, and the Regional Bioethics Program of PAHO is part of Health Services and Systems. It is a pleasure to be here with you during this third and final seminar on the strengthening of research ethics. I should underscore that the work in this project by using indicators to catalyze progress in the ethics research in our region is funded by the Wellcome Trust. This work was started at the request of PAHO's member states to assess outstanding progress and challenges based on the 2018 work done. Before we start, I would like to let you know that we have simultaneous interpretation, and I would like to thank our interpreters ahead of time. And also, to use interpretation, please choose the globe.
For this session, please go to the little globe on the bottom right of your Zoom screen to listen to this session in English. En esta sesión
During this session, we will be focusing on the regional landscape in terms of the last indicator of the set of indicators that we presented in the first session and that we briefly discussed in the previous session, since we would have a specific session on the research conducted in emergency situations and also to assess how our region has performed during the COVID-19 pandemic. During this session, we will have the presentation by Ana Palmero and Sara Carracedo on results of a research that they conducted, funded by WHO and the Epidemic Ethics Program, also a WHO program. As you all know, Sara Carracedo is a consultant with the Regional Bioethics Program of PAHO, and Ana Palmero is responsible for ethics issues within the research department of the Ministry of Health in Argentina, and she's also a consultant with the Bioethics Department of WHO. This research has been conducted independently of her roles with WHO and PAHO. It is a pleasure to have Anna and Sara with us to present the results of this research that has already been published. As a matter of fact, upon concluding this session, we will be sending information on this publication so that all the participants can review it and discuss it in further detail. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the situation of ethics research in our area, and we hope to better understand all of the actions that our region has taken within the context of the pandemic to be able to conduct research in emergency situations with a rigorous but fast ethics review. But I think that this will also be an invitation to reflect on the achievements and also the outstanding challenges, in particular, because I think that there are still some actions that have been taken in the region that lead us to think how, after the pandemic, we need to go back to the virtual scenario, or whether there are some lessons learned from COVID-19, some modifications that are here to stay. I see that you are already doing this. You are invited to share comments, resources using the chat function, and we also invite you to send your questions for the discussion panel by using the Q&A button on Zoom, because that will make it, with that we will make it sure we are not going to miss any of your questions, and we will do our best to gather all of the questions for our discussion at the end of the session. Once again, let me underscore that the spirit of this session is to have a discussion a regional reflection. I think that this is a space that, due to COVID-19, has been open to all of us as a new forum that we have had starting last year. And we think that it is important to know that the goal of this session is to try to support the various countries to think together what worked, what didn't work, what we did and what we didn't do. And let me thank Anna and Sarah for sharing the results of this research investigation carried out during the pandemic with us. Therefore, without further ado, let me give the floor to Anna, who will be starting this presentation. Sarah will continue, and then we will have some time for a discussion, so you can start sending your questions using the Zoom function. Anna, please go ahead. Thank you, Carla. Thank you for this invitation to share our results. And I would like to thank all of the participants. I see that many of the ones who connected today have been collaborating with us in this study. So let me share the presentation with you. I think you can see it, right? Very well. To begin, as Carla just mentioned, I would like to tell you that this is a study that I did with Nulia Cabrera, Sara, and Alia China. This is a study that we did from 3 different institutions, and this is a study that was funded by the call by WHO together with Epidemics Ethics, and this is an exploration of the governance frameworks for the review and the ethics supervision in COVID-19 research. To offer you some context, this is something that we have already discussed within WHO and PAHO. We had great discussion last year, and there were several lessons that we had already learned from previous epidemics. And the most important aspect we already knew is that there is a moral duty to carry out research during health emergencies so that evidence can be quickly produced and we can quickly address any epidemic, not only the one that we had with COVID. And in turn, this also gives room to challenges for researching during an epidemic and a pandemic in particular. First of all, we need to make sure that there is scientific validity behind the research and also observe ethical principles for research. And we also have the duty to reduce practical obstacles to be able to carry out research in an expeditious manner. To that end, one of the most important elements is to be able to guarantee during a health emergency that the ethical review of the research is conducted in an expeditious manner, and also that ethical standards are observed. This also requires to adapt the processes we have for ethical review, and also to coordinate efforts among the various actors in the research process. And this goes beyond ethics committees to avoid any duplication of efforts and also to conduct a more efficient review. We should also take into account the particular ethical aspects that are resulting from the health emergencies, in particular this pandemic. We have several that we will be addressing. As part of that context, we asked what was going on in Latin American countries, in particular, whether the Latin American countries had implemented policies to accelerate the ethical review of research on COVID-19, and also by making sure that it was a rigorous review, and also whether the governance frameworks issued by these countries follow the guidance documents that had been issued for the research ethics of COVID-19, in particular WHO and PAHO documents. So the goals, the specific goals of our study were to identify if the Latin American countries adopted policies and regulations to speed up the ethical review, meanwhile guaranteeing ethical standards, and also to analyze in those documents whether they followed WHO and PAHO guidelines, and in particular in four areas. The first one was related to the creation of an alternative organization for ethical review of COVID-19 research, the mechanisms or the coordination measures that were taken in connection with coordination among committees, and also committees and the various research actors, in particular the health authorities and the national regulatory authorities, the operational procedures to be adopted to speed up the review, and also the ethical oversight of the research, and the adoption of specific ethical aspects in connection with the health emergency. The methodology we followed is a descriptive and exploratory study. We reviewed the regulations and the documents issued by the competent, the relevant authorities in the countries, and these are the 19 countries of Latin America that are Spanish-speaking, including also the Portuguese-speaking Brazil. And we chose these countries because there are some legal similarities that allowed us to compare the various criteria and documents issued. We search official databases, in particular the databases of official gazettes and government pages, in particular government pages with the health authorities and the health ministries. We also analyze the health bioethics committees, and also on pages of the regulatory authorities for medicines. We also carried out a manual search, since because of our daily experience, we had experience with many of those documents. We had a direct contact with the point of contact within the relevant areas in cases in which we needed further clarification of the documents that we found. And we did this between November 1st and December 31st of 2020. Was a very brief, a very short period. So many documents may have been issued after this date, and they were not included in the study. To be able to analyze the documents, we developed an analysis matrix taking into account the documents issued by PAHO and WHO for the review of research ethics during COVID-19. And first, to identify these documents, we determined the first parameter, that was to have at least one document that has been issued by a relevant authority for the review and ethical oversight of research. And we have done this nationally, that is to say, based on the relevant authority within the countries chosen. So if the countries had a different organization, such as, for example, a federal organization, we only identified and analyzed the national documents. Once we identify these documents, we see whether there were strategies for a rigorous and expedited review, and also to compare and to see whether they follow the guidelines, the international guidelines. And what I was telling you, the four dimensions that one can find, the existence, the creation of a specific organization, coordination, operational guidelines, whether they had been issued for the committees, and also whether there guidelines for the review of these key aspects that needed to be taken into account for health emergencies. As to the operational guidelines, we took 10 categories that are also taken from these documents related to these topics. The first one was the availability of the members to be able to carry out these assessments on an expedited basis, whether the members had been trained within the ethics committees in connection with this discipline, that is specialization in health emergencies, and whether the experts had been called in connection with COVID-19 as members or consultants, and whether virtual meetings were being used as something that was already standard, quorum, whether quorum was reduced, and whether electronic means were used for the presentation of projects, and all of the communications that were related to the presentation of a project and the assessment process, whether shorter periods were used for the various processes, whether protocols, model protocols or standardized protocols were used for research, whether there was some sort of procedure that was used for decision making. That is to say, for example, that not all of the decisions were made with all of the members present, and that there could be some decisions that were being made at different times, and whether there were any adjustments for the ethical oversight of procedures that had already been approved. So we analyzed any sort of change that could have been implemented in connection with oversight, and mainly we saw whether there was a change related to the follow-up due to the changes that we had with evidence, changes in evidence with various interventions, for example, the use of convalescent plasma, among others. As to the key aspects for the review of these COVID-19 projects, we considered whether the guidelines that had been drafted for review during the pandemic took these 6 dimensions into account. The first one had to do with informed consent process, whether there were alternative mechanisms that had already been established to obtain consent, and also taking into account the difficulties we faced during the pandemic, in particular at the outset, at the beginning of the pandemic, when there was great uncertainty, lack of knowledge, and isolation of patients, which prevented us from obtaining informed consent by the regular means. The second topic also had to do with the management of the samples and related data for future research. And this is something that in previous epidemics was greatly discussed, because many of those samples leave the countries and there were no mechanisms to be able to protect participants, and also to be able to make sure that those studies and the results of those studies go back to the origin countries, whether there were plans to mitigate the risks due to COVID-19, in particular for this pandemic, and all of the knowledge at the outset in connection with the transmission possibilities, and also strategies to involve the community in this research in connection with COVID-19, whether there were plans for an expedited exchange of data. We know that during any health emergency, it is highly important to exchange information as long as the data has been previously secured, so that we can address the health emergency. This exchange is not only among researchers, but also with decision makers, that is to say, the health authorities, to be able to continue to manage or decide how to manage the pandemic. And the last topic is related to the existence of mechanisms to guarantee access to the benefits of research. We have also seen that in our countries and in our region, there is a large number of clinical trials with interventions and vaccines. So this was a key element to see how mechanisms had been provided for so as to guarantee access to the benefits. In connection with the results, out of the 19 countries that we analyzed, 53%, 9 countries had a governance framework that had to do with the review of the ethical framework for COVID-19 research. These are the countries that had this framework, and you need to bear in mind that we consider that at least they had one document, that in most cases we saw that they had more than one document. So we analyzed the governance framework rather than the regulation as we had expected to do at the outset. And the countries that have mechanisms are Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Mexico, Panama, and the Dominican Republic. As to the organizational model, we will later on give the link to our paper for you to see in detail each of the results. Here I will be offering a general view of the results. And in connection with the organization model, we find that an ad hoc committee for research on COVID-19 was created in Ecuador and Peru. Other countries adopted a strategy to appoint members to the national committee that was already in existence, such as Brazil, Dominican Republic, and Panama, to analyze COVID-19 cases. A specific ad hoc committee was created for specific cases, and this we saw in Costa Rica, even though we noticed that it was not only national because of the importance of the Social Security agency in Costa Rica. And we also noticed that other countries continued with the same system, that is Argentina, Chile, Mexico, and Colombia. As to coordination, only few countries had established specific mechanisms to coordinate among the various committees. This is something that we saw in Brazil in particular. They already had coordination, and it was easier to find this type of coordination mechanism. Chile also includes in their guidelines the possibility to coordinate with ethics committees. And in connection with Colombia, we found coordination among the clinical trial evaluators and also the National Regulatory Authority. This is coordination for them to communicate on the studies that were being assessed, but this is just for clinical trials. In connection with the specific topics under the guidelines for the committees, for the research committees, you can see a great variation in among those topics that we analyzed. What we saw the most was the shortening of the deadlines for the evaluation processes for the research. You know that 99% establish shorter terms, 90% establish shorter terms, and also the use of electronic media. We also saw this in the documents that we reviewed, and as the pandemic moved forward, new documents were being issued in connection with these processes, and at the outset it was considered as an exception, but then it was adopted as something systematic as part of electronic media, and also virtual meetings became commonplace. The availability of members, to be able to have members and experts that could carry out these assessments and fast track these assessments. We know that this requires greater commitment, and this was taken into account. So as to the key ethical aspects for the review of COVID-19 research. What we found the most had to do with plans to mitigate COVID-19 risks, that is to say, to avoid transmission and also the spread of the disease. These are plans that have been requested by the National Regulatory Authority in most cases, by the committees, and a request was made to present this before the ethical committees, the ethics committees, to make sure that they are there, or just to communicate how the study will be conducted during the pandemic. The other items that we identified mostly differ in terms of the content and these points, and it is important to observe the number of countries that adopted alternative processes to obtain informed consent, and they were able to use, for example, electronic media, and also to moving away from the will statement by signing documents and papers, and this was quickly adapted to have a consent based on the pandemic situation. In general, this is from the quantitative point of view. Out of all of the documents that we read, they all have a general call to have a faster review, but we have fewer countries that develop specific mechanisms to be able to review documents faster. And more than 90% or 90% had shorter timelines, but it is not only the assessment that has to be faster, but also it has to be rigorous, and also bearing in mind the specific situation as a result of the pandemic. Out of all of the countries that we analyzed, we only see the 6 countries that have more than 60% of the categories that were analyzed. And at the qualitative point of view, that is to say, at the level of detail, and at the content is quite variable. And we saw many documents that are quite general, without specific mechanisms to reach the goal, to attain the goal that is expected. Now we're moving on to the most interesting aspect that has to do with the discussion of these results. I'll give the floor to Sarah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna. Let me share the screen. Can you see it?
Se ve, pero falta que le pongas. Ahí estás.
There it is. I'd like to thank Anna for the first presentation, how to share results and how we develop this project. I will be focusing on discussion and specific recommendations of this article. And the first comment to make is that many of the Latin American countries, as we have seen, more than 50% of the countries that we assessed adjusted their regulatory frameworks to be able to conduct fast research in response to the pandemic, to the emergency, but doing so in an ethical manner. So we should recognize the effort made by these countries. However, our study also shows that we still have to better prepare to catalyze the research in health emergencies in our region, in particular because there was already a mandate by PAHO member states to be prepared for health emergencies and also to be able to conduct research. There were already some international guidelines, and also because all of the countries that we assessed saw at least one study related to COVID-19 based on the records that we saw on the clinical study platform of WHO. So they were all aware of the need to have mechanisms to guarantee that they can ethically review the information rigorously and efficiently.
Now, in terms of the first category that has to do with organization and coordination for the ethical review and oversight, what's worth highlighting is that all countries must adopt a strategy for their review system to be implemented during health emergencies. This strategy should have coordination mechanisms in order to streamline processes, in order to avoid duplication of efforts, and especially so that we don't waste time, which during an emergency is key. These coordination mechanisms are particularly important when we talk about multi-center studies. And one of the alternatives that we have in the ethical guidance document by PAHO is that this is a good opportunity to explore ethical review strategies in other countries, that is to say, countries where there's not a lot of research and where multi center research studies are done. Maybe a mechanism may be found and explored where ethics review may be done jointly among all of the countries involved. Now, in terms of the REC's operational procedures when they operate under an emergency, it's very important to recognize that even though a lot of the documents that we found were urging for committees to work more efficiently, in these documents, we should see operational guidance that's much more specific. This is because otherwise, the guidance ends up being way too vague, way too general, and it's up to the RECs and their agencies to adjust these procedures, which sometimes, once the health emergency is underway, is hard to do. And it might make us waste time in determining what may be ethically acceptable or not in order for the review to take up quickly. So it's better if these operational guidance for the committees are already part of their regulatory frameworks. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, another very important thing is that ethical reviews should not only be done to do things more quickly, but also the substance of all ethical reviews are the same as those that we use during non-emergencies. However, ethics committee members must strengthen their capabilities because reviewing research during emergency and during a non-emergency may have differences, and we need to have more ethical safeguards when operating in a health emergency context. So we are going to be shown alternative or novel scientific procedures, and maybe we as committees may not have the necessary expertise to review them. There's also a host of studies, and sometimes these studies may not necessarily result in the quality output that's expected. So, this idea that because we're operating in a health emergency context has its limitations, and we as REC members must be aware so that we can review our protocols, because this situation obviously makes our ethical review more challenging. Therefore, we must be aware of that so we can identify all these things when, for example, we are reviewing research and try to call on external or outside experts if needed. So, this is a lesson learned and a recommendation regarding our experience with all the regulatory frameworks that we've encountered because capacity building for RAC committees is only included in one country, Argentina. Finally,
De los protocolos que ya
we have oversight of approved protocols. Protocol oversight should be done more frequently, of course,
los comités tienen que asegurarse, los
but
miembros de los comités,
the committee members must ensure that the ethical acceptability of research is maintained throughout the studies. This is because new evidence comes to life on an ongoing basis, and we need to ensure that they're still ethically acceptable. None of the countries that we reviewed mentioned this at all, even though we do have ethical guidance from PAHO on study oversight by ethics committee whenever new evidence comes up. Now, in terms of key issues, I have five here on the screen that were the ones that were more prevalent throughout our review or that were missing altogether. And that's why we have this traffic light coding like red, yellow, and green. And that's because if there's something that the study showed is that pretty much all the countries, or I would dare say all countries rather, have made significant progress in implementing alternative processes to review informed consent. And that is very important because in addition to all the legal formalities that we have in a lot of our legal systems in this system and very strict regulatory frameworks that sometimes did not enable to have any kind of substitute for paper and we could not replace on face to face consent with anything that had to change during the pandemic. And a lot of the countries that we reviewed realized that it was impossible to take informed consent in the traditional sense that we were used to. So that's why we came up with electronic prior consent, digital signature, pictures, etc. So this is a significant progress in the region.
a suceder
And we
después.
need to wonder what's going to happen after the pandemic once the emergency is over. We have another topic, which is accessing the benefits of research. That was in yellow. And that is because some of the countries did take that into account. Not too many countries, rather, consider that as part of their regulatory frameworks, in spite of the fact that that is an ethical standard that has been used forever. That is to say, ensure that people can access the benefit of research, especially when there were interventions that proved to be efficient and effective for participants and the population in general. So, what we wanted to highlight here in that I believe we need to craft as a message is that and in a health emergency context, we need to have mechanisms and plans in place to ensure that participants can benefit from the output of our research. And that is very important. This can be done through, for example, prior agreements between the different health authorities and the research sponsors. And the committee's role should be to oversee the implementation of these agreements in order to ensure that there's equitable access to the benefits of our research and therefore avoid any kind of exploitation. And in fact, we believe that a lot of the reasons why oftentimes people were late in getting the vaccine was because we did not have those prior agreements in place. So, like I said, the key message here would be to take into account prior agreements or previous agreements or pre-agreements as part of our research plan so that the benefits of this research can be ensured in a fair manner for the participants in the community in general. Now, in terms of collection, store, and future use of samples or specimens and data, it's not something that was reflected in the document that we encountered. And even though this is a standard, having procedures in place in order for data handling and future use of data takes place in an ethical way. So, in that sense, it is very important for us to strengthen the fact that it's necessary for the region to have good governance systems in place in order to handle specimens and data, and that they can safeguard the interest of donors to ensure confidentiality and to have a broad consent phrases where we have these data or material transfer agreements that have to be a responsibility of the committee. So basically, an active role of the ethics forces in terms of the collection, storage, and future use of specimens and data. It's very important to promote this. Another issue
en
that
las regulaciones, en casi todas,
was that came up in a lot of regulation is data sharing, which is very important, especially during emergency situations. We have the moral obligation of being able to share information quickly. And even though there has been a lot of preprints that came up where the outcomes or outputs of a lot of research were printed, even though they were not fully reviewed up to a certain point. This has been a concern because in some cases, public health decisions were made based on preprints when we did not have quality control of those outputs yet. So we need protocols to include plans to quickly disseminate these results ethically by ensuring the scientific integrity of publications, etc.
el comité también debería tener un rol
So
activo
here, the committee should play an active role in the sense that it should be able to review these plans and guide researchers so that dissemination of these outputs or this information is done ethically. And finally,
involucramiento de la comunidad que
we
también
have community involvement or community engagement, which is something that was not present in the regulations that we reviewed. This means that plans need to be in place in order to engage the community as a stakeholder in the ethics review process. We know that community engagement is key in order to build trust and understanding of what research will be about. And these plans also are good to recruit participants. They promote the social value of research, and in general, they promote credibility of the people in science. Therefore, the committee should require them. They should require researchers to submit these plans to engage the community as part of the file that they submit to the committee for the ethical review. And that way, the committees would be meeting the requirement of ensuring that health emergency research is done ethically.
creo que conviene destacar
And
que
finally, I believe it's worth highlighting that a lot of these key aspects, like the three that I highlighted at the end about specimens and data, community engagement, and data sharing, tend to be key aspects that could be considered a weakness pre-pandemic because a lot of the countries did not have them in their regulation. And because it's so evident nowadays that all this must be taken into account, that we need to take this opportunity to include all this in our regulation, and also in general to think and reflect upon how all this could be included for the ethics review beyond the pandemic, how to include it in our governance and research ethics in general. And finally, the message is that we still need to improve our preparedness and ethics in order to be able to do research in an emergency context. And in order to do this, it's very important to adopt a national policy that would enable us to catalyze emergency research,
siempre es más difícil implementar
because it's
estas
always more difficult to implement these research responses once the process is underway versus if we do it beforehand. And this is also very important. It's very important to reflect on this because in many countries, these efforts to adjust regulatory frameworks were partial and they did not have a comprehensive view of research ethics in general or ethical review during emergencies. And these were like a one time effort at the beginning of the pandemic.
los escenarios son
But the
fluctuantes.
pandemic changes the scenarios, and that is why we need to take into account
Como Carla muchas veces lo ha dicho
that,
en
like
diversas
Carla said many times during her different presentations,
afrontar una pandemia no es solamente una
facing a
carrera,
pandemic
¿no?
is
Es
not
tener
just
mucha
a race, 100 meeting, but rather it's a marathon where you have to make a lot of effort and make adjustments along the way as we make progress.
Y finalmente, para ello es necesario
And
que
finally, in order to do all this,
de la ética de la investigación
we
en
need to we need to have an overall view. We need to take lessons learned into account, such as experience from Ebola and the specific recommendations for the region. And especially, we need to take into account the lessons that we are learning during the COVID pandemic. We need more research in order to see what the response from countries in the region have been, as well as LMICs in general, in order to come up with the best practices so we share them and discuss them and see how we can develop international ethics standards that could truly guide countries to guide and adopt strategies at the national level in order to do research in health emergency contexts.
yo he terminado mi presentación.
This concludes my presentation, and I guess we're moving on to the questions and answers, right?
Mil gracias, Sara. Mil gracias,
Thank
Ana.
you so much, Sarah and Anna, for your presentations. I believe that a lot of things are coming to light, especially thinking about the dialogue or the discussion we were having. But I would like to begin by highlighting the last thing that Sarah said. I believe anyone listening to this presentation can see that the Latin American region has been extremely active during the COVID-19 pandemic. That is to say, we didn't just wait for things to happen, but rather a series of active actions were taken during the pandemic. And I would like to highlight that those actions, to a great extent, were possible, or rather, even though those actions were taken during the pandemic, I would like to highlight that starting from the Zika outbreak in the region, we've been discussing all this. So a lot of the cases where actions were taken during the pandemic, it doesn't mean that this topic came up during the pandemic for the first time. I believe that the fast response action is because we had seen this during the Zika outbreak
Discutiendo estrategias
and we
con
had been discussing strategies with the health
Creo que es
authorities.
importante resaltar esto porque
I
cuando
believe it's
uno
important to
quizás hace
highlight
una
this because
comparación a nivel
when
global
you
con
do
otras
a global
regiones,
comparison
uno
with other
puede,
regions,
quizás no puede explicarse todo
you
así,
may not be
pero
able
hemos hecho una
to
excelente
explain how
labor
we
en la
did it. I
región,
believe we did an
pero creo que
outstanding
la
job in the region, but I
diferencia
believe
respecto a
that the
otras
difference
regiones se
between our
debe
region and
a
others
que el
lies in the
trabajo y el
fact that
tema
the work
inició
on this
antes de la
topic
pandemia.
began
Incluso si
before the
ese trabajo
pandemic.
solo dio frutos
And
durante la
that
pandemia.
work that we did before
Ese
the
como un
pandemic
primer
bore fruit during the pandemic. This is my initial comment before moving on to our question. But there's a second comment I would like to make.
Que es que, bueno, han
I would
notado
like to highlight that you may have noticed that this presentation is about the indicator, but it's like we're drilling down on a lot of the indicator components, much more so, that is to say, going much beyond what the indicator actually says. If you remember in our previous session, and I can see that Sofia Salas is here, she asked a question about this. Yes, in fact, on each indicator, I was saying that the indicator is like the tip of the iceberg. So on each indicator, we can drill way down and do something similar to what we did with this one. And I believe that this is key because that gave us a true dimension of what the response in the region has been to the pandemic. I see there are several questions here. Let me begin with one by Julio Gerardo Chinchilla that says, taking into account that some countries implemented adjustments or made adjustments as they were moving forward, do you know if there were any cases where a new review of protocols, of already approved protocols, took place before making changes or developing guidance? I don't know, Anna or Sarah, whether you can answer this question.
Sara, ¿quieres responder o si no responde, como quieras?
Sarah, if you want to, otherwise I will. I'm not aware of one specific case about this, but I believe that
Los estudios multicéntricos,
in these
¿no?
multi-center studies and the potential duplicity of effort during the review process is to precisely avoid duplication of efforts. That is to say, to have coordination mechanisms that would enable for a study to not go through 50 different committees with different procedures and different findings at the end, etc., but rather to be able to beforehand regulate the situation and come up with the best possible way to ensure that any given response or decision by the committee matches the times of the emergency. I don't know, Anna, if you want to add anything.
Antes de responderle a Julio, quería hacer un par de
Before
aclaraciones.
replying to Julio, I wanted to make some clarifications because I saw some comments about the limitations of this study. This study was done based on the documents issued by competent organizations, mainly authorities, health authorities, or other types of authorities from the different countries. So, for example, we got aware of countries such as Cuba that had certain guidance, but we were never able to access the official document per se, and that's why we didn't include that in this process. And I also wanted to say that in addition to this article that we're sharing with you here today, there's also a more extensive report. Sophia was talking about the vaccination committee that was not included because it's not a review committee per se, but it is connected to the organization and is included in that broader report that I referenced. So if you go there, you will find more information on each one of the topics that the countries worked on. And now going back to Julio's question, I understand that you're talking about the changes that came up in terms of evidence and whether changes in the protocol review process were made. Personally, I can speak to my experience here in Argentina. Here, there were studies that were reviewed, but we have to take into account that we are a federal country and that there's no coordination between the different committees, not only from the different provinces, but also within each one of the provinces. We had situations where one committee does a review and the other committee doesn't even know that that review took place. So that's why we ran into some difficulties to coordinate assessments on matters that are key and that have to do with the participants' safety and security. So sharing new information on, or if a committee changes their their criteria as the pandemic moves forward, the other ones should do the same, or at least be aware of the changes that are being made at the different centers and in the different research studies. That's why it is so necessary to have, like I said, these coordination mechanisms between and among the committees, and to have this managed at the country level, not only at the institutional level, so that we can have a true ethics review system during the pandemic.
La importancia de ese
Thank
abordaje a
you
nivel
so much, Anna. Yes, it's very important to have that national approach, and that's what distinguished PAHO's ethics guidance versus what the WHO did for this. We began by suggesting strategies at the country level because we knew that if each of the committees would change their proposals, we could have 20, quick reviews, but there would be 20 reviews nonetheless. On the chat, I copy the documents, the PAHO's documents in several countries, or rather the two languages that we're working with, which is English and Spanish. And before moving on to the next question, I would like to add to what Sarah and Nat said, in the sense that if you look at PAHO's documents on this topic, they have insisted not only on the review aspect, but also the ethics oversight aspect. So it's not just, to give an initial blessing to ensure that everything goes well forever, but rather it highlights the importance of ensuring that this study continues to remain ethics. Then we have a question from Lizette Perez in Cuba about what do you mean by broad informed consent and what it means. I believe that this is a topic that is very important to clarify because it's key in order to catalyze research, ethics research. Yes, Sarah mentioned that it's important to have broad informed consent, especially when it comes to obtaining specimens and data for future use. That is to say, during emergency, we need to respond not only to the emergency per se, but also to be able to study that in the future. And when I say future, it may be the day after, or the month after, or the year after, on that research and see what we can learn from there. And that is why obtaining specimens during the pandemic and data during the pandemic is extremely necessary. It's a highly valuable research. So it's a highly valuable element, but all this has to be done ethically. As you say, people have to be informed. We need to go through the um, consent process, and it's called broad informed consent in the sense that when we're taking their consent, we don't know exactly what research the data will be used for. That's different from specific consent. We cannot tell a participant specifically what the purpose of storing and using that specimen will be because we may not know that at that time. But there are certain elements that must be present in that consent in order for the person to make that decision freely, so they can know where their specimens are, and so they can have a broad idea of what the specimens will be used for. For example, it will be for COVID research, then who's the responsible party or agency, and how I can withdraw my consent. People may end up saying, I don't want my samples to be used, so I withdraw my consent. So we need to have this consent in order to be able to guide the way in which we handle and manage specimens. So when we collect the sample, we need to ask the participant, regardless of the context, be it research or be it diagnosis or clinical, whether they are willing to donate their specimen and data for future research, and for the person to know where those samples or specimens will be and who the person responsible for handling those specimens will be. Thank you so much, Anna. In the chat, I pasted the PAHO guidance for ethics oversight of COVID-19 research in response to emerging evidence.
Now, as to what Anna explained, I have already included the guideline document, that is to say, what we publish here at WHO based on the Zika numbers, where we go into this number in depth. I would like now to combine the questions by Freddy Tinajero and Marta Aguirre, because I think that there is a common thread. Freddy is saying that WHO's advisory to countries during the COVID-19 pandemic was missing. Several studies that were going to generate evidence lacked a clear regulatory guideline, and the authorities requested 100% evidence, but the study to generate evidence and whether the study was to generate evidence, and there is not a medicine in the world that is 100% effective. And then Marta Aguirre is asking about the use of interventions that had no evidence beyond research framework. She's saying that the management of products such as ivermectin, azithromycin in the hospital context and not a clinical trial required informed consent by patients, but it was not provided. Currently, it is indicated in the outpatient visit. And how is this regulated? And she's apologizing for going beyond the topic because it is limited to randomized clinical trials, but it is not, because I think that the way to proceed and based on changing thresholds is an important issue. Sarah, Anna, who would like to address this? Let's see how we can answer this. As to the evidence thresholds and the need to have a consent for a clinical trial, this is something that was somehow analyzed with the researchers to see the need we have to strengthen our members within the ethics committee to be rigorous in our research of the topics, because there is no proven intervention, there is no effective medicine to address COVID, specifically at the beginning of the pandemic. So the members of the committee needed to know how to assess that protocol to consider it ethically acceptable or not, because as I mentioned, it was not only about approving whatever we had, because we had nothing, so something is something, but that is not the idea. As members of the committee, we need to issue rigorous evaluations based on the information we have, and also taking into account the thresholds that are being modified as to the evidence available, and that could also justify different interventions. So that was my comment in connection with this first section. As to the second section, Anna, I don't know if you'd like to say something else, but this has to do with the MERI framework, and it has to do with the non-proven methods that can be used beyond trials and the ethical compliance. But I give the floor here to Anna. Thank you, Sarah. This is something that we saw in our region, the use of these unapproved interventions beyond the context of the research, and we have seen this implemented as a policy without any possibility to say yes or no, without an informed consent process. We should say that PAHO had already issued a guideline on the implications of this MERI framework that is the result of this, that is to say, the need to use and also the uncertainty that we have given the lack of interventions. that gives gives way to the idea of it is better of giving something as better than not giving anything. And this is something the policy applied for many of our countries, of our governments in the Americas, but without taking into account the logical framework that would be needed to implement this type of process or program. In the Mary's framework, and based on past epidemics, in particular the Ebola epidemics, is trying to have programs, let's say programs that have some scientific evidence. It is not that I can do whatever I want. And for these programs, it is important that if we are going to provide this intervention to the population, not only to the patient, data has to be collected so that we can continue to or start to generate evidence, and we can reproduce this under rigorous conditions during a clinical trial to determine whether that intervention is useful or not. And this has been missing in the country, in the region, that is to say, knowledge as to how to implement these processes. And this has also led to an unnecessary expenses. We know that evidence has shown us that ivermectin not being useful, and also that azithromycin not being useful either, because we have strong evidence that they are not useful for COVID. So this is a leg we need to work on in the region. I totally agree, and we continue with the pillars or the legs we need to work on in the region. Fernando Narvaez makes some observations as to the asymmetry among the northern countries, the northern rich countries, and the southern countries in connection with the ability they have to do research, where the research was conducted, and oftentimes they were planned in some countries but centralized in others, or not exclusively. So the landscape is quite diverse. But I think that the most challenging concept that Fernando is presenting is we have guidelines, but what are the actions that we can implement? And as he is highlighting, the guidelines by WHO and PAHO are not binding, but how could we work so that the guidelines are implemented more widely, better, and sooner? In that connection, I think that it is important to bear in mind that the research ethics is part of the research in each country. We cannot separate this. They go hand in hand. And if we would like to conduct research that is valuable for our population, this should go hand in hand. So we clearly need a strong research policy in our countries and also in our region. And this is something that we can move on to the regional level. We have several similarities, and this allows us to think of policies and programs all together. The guidelines are useful to have guidelines, recommendations internationally, as long as the context is taken into account. And that's the reason why it is important to participate from the region. All of the work that PAHO does is important to take what we do, and also they should be implemented in policies in our countries. Many of the participants today have some sort of role in that. We might not have the power to define a policy, but we are working for all of these things to happen, to change, and it is important to start working together. The research ethics is not a separate entity from the other health policies, and research is part of health and part of the response from the area of health. And it is not something that we do here and there, and that here and there we have some financing and someone is carrying out some research. So this has to be taken into account for the decision making for health policies beyond emergencies, also during regular times. So Yes, we do have the responsibility to work and for that to become a policy in all of our countries. Sara, anything else to add? I just wanted to highlight the advocacy role, that is to say, for our relevant health authorities, our competent authorities, we need to tell them that we need policies to face research to tackle the pandemics. And this indicator and this question in particular, how does the indicator reduce the asymmetry between the northern and southern countries? I think that it is important to have clear concepts in the countries to carry out research during an emergency, and this offers or affords some flexibility to each of the parties. And every party that does research would always favor a country that has clear rules of the game. So, and by taking into account this indicator, we should promote research within the country since the rules are clear. For example, something used to take 40 days, now it's going to take 10. So, and this is the way we'll work. So we have more opportunities to have inside research, and also so that within the country we can enhance the capacity to carry out research. Thank you very much. Sofia Salas has a question on the experience in the region, taking into account the various strategies to avoid the repetition, duplication in the ethic review processes, and whether you have any information on the most positive outcome. Is it with a centralized committee or with an ad hoc committee? I guess we could have it together, but Sophia, that should be our next research to see how, in particular, all of these regulations and documents have worked together, the regulations issued by the countries, because the context of each country is quite different. For example, in countries where there is a federal organization, to have a national committee or centralized committee is something that did not work, because there is a great deal of research to be done. The contexts are very different, and we should analyze each case by case, to see what was the most useful or not. But we could in general see that the shortening of deadlines has also sped up research, and there is a very interesting amount of research in the region, but we need to assess what happened with the rigorous aspect of research, whether it improved or not, what happened with that aspect. So yes, we'd love to do it. We'd love to have that for our next research. I also wanted to add something, and these are the more centralized initiatives. And this is something that I mentioned during the presentations, and this is something that is in our paper too. The efforts are not a one-time effort. It won't be useful to have an ad hoc committee if that ad hoc committee has honorary members, and at the beginning of the pandemic, we may have all had some time to participate. We were more enthusiastic to participate, to help each other, but the emergency continued, and it continued in all of the countries. And then someone went back to work and started doing something else. So if this is not supported by the authorities, and if we are not looking at various options as the emergency continues, and we stay with what we did at the outset, we might have a bad experience. It might not be the best situation. So we need ongoing solution, ongoing support with the various alternatives. It could be, well, I can also, for example, have joint alternatives in my country with other countries. But I think that this is also inviting us to think about aspects beyond the pandemic. The fact that the committee members are almost honorary members, or members that give up their time during an emergency. Is that a good idea, or should we change the way of thinking and try to implement some new ways so that we can have different ethics committees from now onwards? Thank you very much, Sarah. I think that you're putting a very important topic on the table. Several things have changed, and now the question is, in which cases are we going back to what we did before, and in which cases are we going to make the new way of working the way to proceed for the ethics committees? I think that we have faced practical situations that are difficult, and going back to the 100-meter race, I think that there are some strategies that may have worked perfectly well for 100 meters, but when they said, okay, ready, set, go, nobody knew. We all started to run, but we didn't know where the race was going or how long the race was going to be.
So that led us to reflect on how we should work in the future. And maybe,
Fundos de que ninguno
and uh, this is the most heartfelt wish that would never see a pandemic again in our lifetime. We should have options. So maybe option A is maybe a yellow fever outbreak, so something that's short, and then we have option B for something more long term. I believe this is part of what we need to analyze.
diálogos que
If you
tuvimos con
remember, in the series of discussions that we held with Sarah and Anna last year, I believe it was exactly a year ago,
comités, autoridades
some
sanitarias,
of the colleagues from the different committees, health authorities, researchers, etc., were making many of these comments. What we did was great at the beginning, but then it became impossible. So, could there be a way to prevent that and have option A, option B? I don't know. There's no way to do any kind of literature in our research and see what worked and what didn't work because this is the first time. So if you go to the SIOM's guidelines said what should be done, but not how. So we're still learning, and Lizette's Perez comment, my colleague from PAHO, on the chat on the importance for PAHO to study this more thoroughly. Let me say that we are studying this, and we're working on a publication not only on the regional assessment using all the other indicators, but also we are developing a guidance document that will condense all the previous guidelines, but it would also reflect the lessons learned in a region. Because that's the purpose of these discussions. And we are extremely grateful that you're here
y compartir
because we need to hear from you and we need to share what works, what doesn't work, etc. Now, Lisette makes another comment here. It's a question rather on another aspect that has to do with disclosing results. We talked about doing research, catalyzing information, do things quickly, but then what happens once all of this is over? So studies yield outputs or results. So how do we decide whether those results will be disseminated, whether they will be published, or whether we will just keep records?
pero
Ideally, we should have the records first and then have a publication. But how do we know where we are and what we have learned about that one topic in the region?
Bueno, tal vez sobre este tema,
Well, maybe on this topic, I could bring us back to previous sessions where we evaluated each one of the indicators, one of which being for each country to have WHO standard compliant records in their countries. And we also saw that out of three countries, that there's only three countries in the region that have those. And there was a similar question where it was also mentioned that we may not know a lot about this link between the usefulness of public records and the use of results. And maybe over time, we will need to adjust the indicators so that ultimately we can have this link between disclosing results and having public records for clinical trials. I don't know if any of you has anything else to add on this and the pandemic.
Tal vez mencionar que en
Oh,
este
and I would also like to say that in this article where we worked on last year regarding the research that was included recorded in the ICTRP, we saw that these results indicator was not completed or populated yet. So we don't know when we the results from research will be ultimately populated and then how we can use information in that specific box.
Em, con respecto a lo que es la divulgación
In terms of dissemination of knowledge and specifically regional dissemination or country level dissemination, it is also important for that to be part of a country policy because regardless of us, registering the information and maybe there's room for improvement in terms of country records, we need to decide what we're going to use that information for in order for that knowledge and that information to come back into benefits for our society and how we can use that evidence to inform the decisions that need to be made by our authorities. So it's not just a matter of having one thing in time. Again, it's the whole concept of having a system. That is to say, not having records just for having records per se, but to have that turn into something that becomes useful and to close the loop. So it is important for that to be reflected and taken into account in the research policies of each one of our countries and see how, again, we develop that information and how to have that information be used for decision-making purposes in our countries.
Creo que esta es una pieza.
I
Hablamos de la
fully agree. We talked about knowledge generation or knowledge development, but there has to be a reason of why we create knowledge, which is the scientific and social value. So that happens when that knowledge becomes public and is used.
también en relación a la pregunta de Lisette.
And also going back to Lizette's question, we have an indicator specifically for clinical trial records that we had included before the pandemic. But I believe that before the pandemic, it was harder for us to justify why that was important. But now, after the pandemic, the importance of having research records has become clear. For example, what kind of research is being uh, done on COVID-19 or any other topic has become key. And I should also like to mention a work by our colleague Ludovic Herveix at PAHO, which is a few years old now, but it will be important to redo this. And it's just not making sure that things are recorded, but how they're recorded. And one of the comments that he made on a research that was published many years ago, about clinical trial records in the region is that oftentimes information is not recorded properly. That is to say, we don't include the participant beforehand like WHO requires, but also it's a way of publishing the information without going through the peer review process. So we would like to invite all of you that have joined us today to do this because it's not PAHO is not the only responsible for doing all this. I believe all of you and all of us could be part of this research and see what is being recorded, how it is recorded, how the record matches publication of results. The study that we mentioned a few minutes ago that I pasted on the chat on the record of clinical trials in the region, where somebody could pick up the next study and say, out of all these studies that were included in the article published by PAHO, we could publish some, but some we could not, and that would be excellent food for thought for a region. I believe that here we all must do our part. Okay, we're running out of time, but since this is the last session on this series on research ethics indicators, I wouldn't like to address Lizette's next question that says, why don't we have a pre-qualification system at PAHO level for research systems? Research systems have a lot of components, but I, as responsible for the regional bioethics research program for PAHO, can address this question from the national research ethics component. Like I said, we are undergoing an assessment in the entire region, and soon we will be publishing a piece of work done by Bernardo Aguilera, who was here with us last week. And we wrote an article evaluating the 22 countries that have over a million, a population of over a million in a region in light of the research ethics indicators. Now, in the region, like we said in our previous session and the one before that, we know that a lot of things are done off the record or unofficially. That is to say, a country may not have any legislation requiring all research with human participants to be reviewed, but most countries do that. So we need to capture that wealth and that diversity in our region where we are making a lot of progress, and this information may be lost unless we review all the progress that we have made. So that's our objective, and that's what we're doing. And it has been the most laborious part of our work. And the objective ultimately would be for research ethics standards to be met, not only just because a given institution is very concerned about fostering research in their countries, but rather to be done as a countrywide policy. That's what we're shooting for. However, I believe that as a result of this complexity, it will be easier to have like a pre-qualification system, but that could shed some erroneous information, because within a country there may be large differences, and our primary effort would be to do justice to that diversity and to push for standardization, because all of us and in all areas and in all jurisdictions, all research should be done pursuant to the highest research ethics standards and pursuant and following international standards. We only have a couple of minutes left. I don't know if Sarah and Anna have some closing remarks. All I have to say is thank you so much once again for joining us. And the regional activity that is still left to done is not on research ethics, but on public health ethics. So while Anna and Sarah make some closing remarks, I am going to share the link to subscribe to the public health ethics mailing list that PAHO has, in case you are not a part of that either. Thank you to our support staff and to our interpreters.
Yo solamente quiero agradecer a todos por su
I
participación.
would just like to thank everyone for joining us today, and we will be pasting the link with the publication so that you can all access that. And if you have any questions or any comments on our country, on your country specifically, maybe you can access to this report. You can write to us and we'll be able to, and we'll try our best to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Me sumo al agradecimiento.
I
Gracias a
would
todos.
also like to thank you for joining and for staying all the way to the end. So thank you so much, Carla and Sarah, for this opportunity of showing our work, and we'll keep working to do things even better in our region. Thank you.
Gracias a todos y una buena tarde. Les compartimos
Thank
ahí.
you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day. And you have the link there for the mailing list. And hopefully we'll see every one of you in our upcoming session as well. So thank you so much, and we'll be in touch.